All right, so going to cover a little bit about reporting, dealing with assessment of student learning data. Let me share my screen and we'll jump right into it. Screen to share. So I know that on the FIT employee portal site that I believe many of these reports are already linked, but I'll take you through kind of, I don't know, a typical end user experience. That way, if you need to find these reports for yourself, we can make sure that you know how to navigate there and get access to them. Also, I know that we've been working a bit with Janine to clean up some of the links on the employee portal sites, especially as the transition is happening to migrate all of those sites with IT right now. So if the links aren't correct or they might be pointing to some of the older reports currently, we'll make sure that those get all cleaned up and updated and aligned with what we're going to discuss here today, so that hopefully there won't be any confusion or anything. So hopefully you're familiar at this point with the new reporting portal, or reports.riosalato.edu. When you navigate to the homepage here, there's a faculty folder specific to reports that are meant for faculty chairs and their designees. So you can come in here and there's a host of things available to you, things like reports that deal with faculty evaluations, so data that I think is tracked in FIS, et cetera, as well as some reports dealing with assessment of student learning. So there are two reports in particular that I wanted to cover today, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page with their purpose and what they're meant to represent. And then, like I said, get some questions, hopefully, and some feedback about what else we might want to include, or any outstanding requests that you might have for more information around this subject. So the first report that I want to take a peek at today is the Dynamic Assessment Data Display, or DAD report. So this report is a tool that is used to understand how students are performing on subjective assessments only, respective to one of the 5 college-wide student learning outcomes. So those are critical thinking, reading, writing, information literacy, and oral communication. So this tool takes data that are submitted by students, assessments that are submitted by students for subjective assessments, organizes them based on the rubric dimensions in the rubrics for these assignments, and then aligns dimensions to one of those 5 college-wide learning outcomes based on the work that we've done with the learning outcomes coordinators to manage the crosswalk of all the various rubric naming conventions and the 5 learning outcomes. And we'll talk about that here in just a little bit further, about maybe some future efforts and enhancements that are coming there. So within this report, you've got to kind of set your parameters and how you want to view the data and organize the information. The start dates and end dates are kind of an interesting thing. I think in many instances, depending on your reporting cycles, many folks might set it for a fiscal year, so it defaults to a fiscal year layout, as you can see here, with July 1, 19 to June 30, 2020. That's certainly one way to use it. Another way that might be more effective is by aligning the dates that you're searching for, either based on a particular academic semester or time period of interest, or potentially knowing what you know about when courses are updated and content is refreshed and new versions of courses are coming online. You might set the dates relative to those timeframes. That way you know that the data that you're looking at is all inclusive of a particular version of a course, and you're not kind of crossing over different versions of courses, so to speak, where content might have shifted or questions might have changed. So not knowing all of those details myself, for today, I'm just going to set this to the first of the year to kind of the midpoint in the year. This percent at college level filter is an opportunity that you have to kind of customize this for yourself. So by default, this is set at 80%, meaning that the report is going to highlight any items that fall below this threshold of 80%. So, globally, by and large, we have a goal that speaks to wanting students to meet that 80% threshold. And so that's where the report defaults to. If you want to find students who, might be underperforming, relative to that 80%, then you have some flexibility there to kind of enter in whatever value you want here. So if you wanted to see, students, 50% of students who are meeting college level, you could do that if you wanted to get a little bit more detailed with your analysis. With prefixes, that's pretty cut and dry. You can select whatever you want. I'm going to pick on Angela Felix today because I know that she wouldn't mind, and also that she does so much work with this that this is pretty well tuned to her needs. And pick Spanish 102 from the course list. You can select multiple free prefixes in multiple courses at your discretion. The report will handle that. It might take it a little bit longer to run depending on how much data you're bringing in to the tool, but by and large, it'll handle it. I tend to look at one course at a time. That way it's a little bit cleaner and easier to understand, but it just depends on how you want to use it and what you're reporting on. You have the ability to filter results to see all results, or you can filter it to only items that meet the threshold or fall below the threshold rather. And that's dependent on this level that you set up here. So if you're saying that the threshold is at 80% and you only want to see the items that students are performing below that level, then you can say only items below the threshold. And so the report, when it renders, will only be inclusive of those assignments instead of everything. And then for now, I'm going to leave this population filter blank, but you do have the ability to kind of disaggregate the data to see how student populations are performing against one another. So we've got a few different options here for you: co-curricular, developmental education, ethnicity, gender, and Pell status. So selecting one of these filters will kind of enable an additional breakout of the data where you can see the results of all students compared to then the results of students in each of those different populations. The logic for all this you'll see is indicated kind of in the footnotes of the report, but for the purposes of each of these, there's some specific kind of definitions that you'll want to take note of. That way you fully understand what's being represented with those breakouts. So let's go ahead and run this report based on what we're looking at here and see what we got. So you can kind of collapse this view so you can get a better representation of the data. And so then we'll see, for July 1st of this year to June 30th of this year for Spanish 202, all the data that comes back and the breakouts for all the information relative to those 5 college-wide learning outcomes. So the report is reporting on for all submissions for each rubric dimension, how many submissions were received, and then what percentage of those students were performing at college level as defined as, earning a 70% on the assignment or greater. And so then the highlighting you're seeing goes back to that threshold that we set at 80%. So if we had changed that, for instance, to, 60% only, then we would have, seen a bit different highlighting down here. And that's where you have the ability to kind of define that for your own liking. As you can see, not all assignments are necessarily linked to one of the 5 college-wide learning outcomes. And so that's like an important consideration to keep in mind. Doesn't necessarily mean that something isn't working, but it just means that there's potentially an opportunity to make sure that the alignment is consistent with what your expectations are. So we're leveraging those rubric dimension titles in question mark to create this alignment. And so you can see for dimensions that don't have a custom description entered in, it'll just default to dimension. And for that, we don't have any of that alignment. But for dimensions that do have some sort of curated content or a specific descriptor in here, then, in many instances, those things are relayed to one of the college-wide learning outcomes. Then you can start to see how that data is representative of student performance relative to those 5 pieces. There's a summary table available up here for you so that you can see kind of based on the parameters that you've included, the date ranges and the courses and everything that you're looking at, how students globally are performing relative to those 5 indicators. And then you can see more granularly for each of the rubric dimensions, how students are performing in that space. I will say that you should know that there's probably opportunity for there to be improvement in terms of the crosswalk of the dimension names to the learning outcomes. So to give folks a bit of a history lesson, because I know that there's some newer chairs in the audience here. Way back when, we made an effort to do the best, to the best of our ability, align, you know, kind of the most frequently used names to one of the 5 college-wide learning outcomes. And in working with the learning outcomes coordinators that kind of oversee the work relative to each of those areas, we got pretty good saturation with defining how each of those learning outcomes was going to reflect the college-wide learning outcome. Since that time, however, there's, you know, been many more dimension names added. You know, there's a lot of flexibility and customization that happens there, and so it's not 100% saturated where we've got every single dimension name that exists in question mark aligned to one of the learning outcomes. We are working actively to try and figure out, you know, a better solution where we might be able to create more consistency and more alignment so that we can have more data aligned to those learning outcomes and have, you know, a better understanding of total performance respective to the learning outcomes, but there is some opportunity there. So I think the takeaway is that as you're working to revamp courses or redevelop things, that you're working with your course production teams to make sure, when possible, that the naming conventions that you're using in this dimension field are aligned to the learning outcomes in a way that you'll get the data that you're hoping to receive. We can always create, you know, custom one-off reports and things based on the need. For instance, if we're going through program review and you know, we're expecting to see something that we're not seeing, you know, we have the option to create like a one-off report for you. But in terms of getting it incorporated into this tool and you being able to have access to that information real time and over time, the best way for us to do that and achieve that is to make sure that the naming conventions that we're using here are things that we have already aligned to the learning outcomes. But again, more work is coming on that, and we're trying to get some better consistency in that space. And so hopefully we'll have some good updates to share with you all coming from the assessment team in that work soon. So one of the things that we didn't utilize here right off the bat was this population filter. So as I mentioned, you do have the ability to kind of break down the data further if you have, you know, particular areas of interest or projects or equity outcomes that you're hoping to achieve between different student populations. You can see by selecting one of these options how students overall are performing against the selected populations. Down here at the bottom of the report, there is a definition sections which kind of walks you through how each of these groups are defined. Specifically for something like co-curricular, what does that mean? So for the purposes of this particular tool, it's inclusive of our honors students, our adult A students, and our PTK students. So if students are included in one of those groups and they're active in that community during the time where they're enrolled in this course, then they'll show up in that filter so that you can see the data for students who are in co-curricular programming compared to students who aren't in co-curricular programming, and see what the performance of those students looks like compared to one another. Similarly, you can see definitions for the other groups as well. So let's just pick something like gender is an easy breakout to see. It's nice and simple in terms of how wide the data gets. But you can see here that by selecting that filter and reprocessing the data, we're able to see how our male students are performing compared to students overall, how our female students are performing compared to students overall, and then how male and female students are comparing against one another. That way, if you know, like I said, if there's any specific initiatives or projects that you have underway to try and close equity gaps, or if this is an area of interest for you, you've got the flexibility to dig into that data. Yeah, Angela.
Just real quick, when you went over the definition for co-curricular, I thought NSLS was supposed to be included. We use that for our assessment report. I thought that was part of this as well.
NSLS is part of it. What I would offer is that just based on my knowledge of how well the student groups are managed, I don't know that NSLS as a student group is managed as cleanly as honors and adult ACE and PTK. So NSLS is technically incorporated, but I don't know that there's any active students in the NSLS student group.
Oh, so then that's something we probably need to go back to with the assessment team, because we include that in our assessment reports and everything else. So maybe we need to go back and find out if we need to exclude that population or if we can do a better job of making it clear, because from what I understand, that they have quite a few students.
They do have quite a few students. I think the disconnect in how the data is incorporated is that we need to leverage some sort of identifier to tag those students as being participants in NSLS. And this isn't meant to call out anyone in particular, but in having worked with student life and trying to get a sense of their student population, we've recently found that there's a lot of delay or kind of backlog and making sure that students are affiliated with that particular student group. So while the data is incorporated and why it's not included in this definition here is I'm not sure, and I'll get that updated, but they're technically supposed to be in there, but it's just a matter of whether or not the student group is being managed effectively.
Okay, we can certainly circle back around on that later.
Yeah, but I appreciate it, Angela. Thank you. And sorry, I don't know that you were on the call when I initially said I was picking on you by using Spanish, but
Oh, I don't care. That's fine.
yeah. So so as with all reports in this platform, you obviously have the ability to kind of export it into whatever format is to your liking for whatever purposes you need. You could print it out if you wanted a hard copy. But that's kind of the nuts and bolts of how the report is meant to function. This tool has a lot of flexibility and customization from you as an end user. So I think the real the real trick with it and the magic with it is being able to define your scope of interest with all these parameters up here, and like I said, paying special attention to knowing when your courses are being updated and refreshed and revamped, being able to use these date parameters as a way to really identify student performance kind of pre-change and post-change, so you can make sure that things are trending in the direction that you're hoping to see them trend.
Zach, it's Angela again. Can I just make one quick comment?
Please.
I just would like everyone to be cognizant when using the summary tables, because if you have, for example, a rough draft and a final, or you have an assessment that students are building on, through maybe several lessons, it could throw off that summary table data, because maybe in the first or second iteration of the assignment, they're not meeting the goal. Right? So what you really want to look at is drilling down to the assignments themselves. You wouldn't necessarily want to, start a PDCA cycle on like that lesson 12 assignment where it says borrador, that is a rough draft. So you would expect that students aren't doing as well on that one, but you want to make sure that they're showing improvement by the final essay. So I've seen that across multiple disciplines, right? That they're looking at the summary table and thinking they're not meeting the goal. But when you drill down into the assignments, you go, oh, wait a minute. It's actually a good thing that the student, earlier in the class wasn't meeting the goals, but then they did further on. So just to make sure to keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's a great point. I appreciate you bringing that forward, because you've got kind of this longitudinal view that you as a subject matter expert, knowing the content of the course, you have that visibility to see, students performing at a 32% here compared to students performing at, I forget which assignment you said was the final one, but, getting upwards into the 80%, 72% down here. And so there is a progression happening. And so this table up here is just aggregating all the data together, whereas you can see, kind of the trend following the student sequence through the curriculum content here. So another great way to investigate the information. Any other questions, thoughts, or concerns on this particular tool before I shift over into another report? Hearing none, I will take your silence as indicative of you're not all experts in the DAD and we can look at something else. So another important report that you have access to in terms of understanding student assessment data is essentially an item analysis report. So whereas the DAD is meant to analyze and report on subjective assessments and relay the content to one of the 5 college-wide learning outcomes, this item analysis report, and it's labeled here objective assignment review, is something that is, by definition, only looking at objective assignments in these courses and trying to provide for you all some visibility into, particular questions or assignments that might have some opportunity for revision or improvement based on student performance. So the nuts and bolts of this report and where the power comes in is that the report pulls in the data and it analyzes it and it looks at students' performance on each question. And it will flag questions based on one of 2 characteristics. One of the characteristics that will cause the report to flag a question is that fewer than 50% of the students successfully answered the question and got it correct. A second reason why a question might be flagged is that students who performed better overall on the entire assignment scored better on a particular question than students who performed worse on that assignment. So if students who tended to get lower grades performed exceptionally strong compared to students who tended to get higher grades, then a question will be flagged because it's indicative that something might be a bit off. It could just be that those students were better prepared for that particular question, but the literature and kind of the research that's gone into this framework over time, calls that out for something that we might want to be paying attention to. So this is really a redevelopment of the item analysis report that was previously available through the perception question mark interface that many of us had access to. At some point that got deprecated and I don't know if anyone still has access to it, but we rebuilt the report on our own terms with our own data and tools to be able to continue to have access to that functionality. So this functions much the same way as the DAD did in terms of defining your start and end dates. Again, I would encourage you to be mindful of changes that you've made to the curriculum or any sort of projects that you have with respect to PDCA cycles or anything like that, that you want to be paying attention to the dates on. Having like a fiscal year date range is always like an easy default thing, but that's not always meaningful depending on your purpose and what you're hoping to achieve. So you have the flexibility there. Whereas with the DAD, you could incorporate multiple courses and multiple prefixes into the report. I would encourage you to use just a single course prefix and assignment when running this data. The report itself will function if you select multiple courses, multiple prefixes, and multiple assignments, but the data just gets a little overwhelming and a little clunky to work with, and I think loses its value a little bit when you're trying to pull too much information into it. So using the same course that we just looked at, I'm just going to pick lesson 14 final exam part 1. And then the data will all render into this table. The rules that I had kind of clunkily described before are stated here. So if a student or if students, fewer than 50% of students achieved a successful outcome on a particular question, then it'll flag it as red. Similarly, students who answered the question incorrectly but performed better on the overall assignment compared to others, that question will also get flagged for that purpose. So this first one that's getting flagged here, 95% of students pass this question, which is great. But what this is telling us is that for students who failed this question, their total score, their average scores on the assignment was a 74% compared to 69% for students who passed this question. So it's telling you that, based on what we would think we know about students who have, kind of mastery of these concepts and the content, that those students actually did poor on this question. So that we want to, potentially take a peek at this and make sure that the question is stated properly, or that, the response options are, stated properly or aren't confusing in some way or misleading in some way. Obviously we want to have, a lot of options and diversity for students there, but if like the detractor is, too strong or misleading in some way, then we want to take a peek at that and make sure that things are working as intended. So the red highlighting is just kind of your quick visual cue to see, potential items that you might want to consider taking a peek at for, performance improvement. But generally speaking, it'll walk through questions one by one and give you the analysis for each question. So, you can quickly run down the list and just kind of get a visual cue of what's trending. So for these questions, they're being highlighted because fewer than 50% of the students passed. Since we do have such strong content knowledge on so many of the other questions, there's potential here to investigate what's going on to see if we can, understand why students are failing this question by and large, but, passing this question, so well. This one is much more straightforward. You don't have the ability to really break out the data by different student populations, et cetera. It's really just meant to be a tool for quick insights and analysis for each of the objective assignments that fall into your curriculum. Is there a way to change? Hold on, sorry, Gordon. I saw the question pop up quickly and like a little bubble, but I couldn't read it quickly enough. Sorry, fumbling around with.
Yeah, I can take this one. It just happens to be that we had to flip around which field was going to be the description field and which field was actually going to be the question field because of how special characters were populating in the feedback tool. So for it to populate correctly in the feedback tool, we had to put this weird gobbledygook in the description field. That's why it looks weird here. It's something that's unique to my department, and your question should actually show up correctly because your description and the question itself should match. Mine just don't.
Yeah, having looked at some of this for many courses, like Angela said, this is the only language courses are the only ones that I've ever seen any sort of like, kind of like foreign characters popping up in there. So, like you indicated, Angela, I'm sure it's just a function of the content and needing to work around the solution. So yeah, again, this one's pretty straightforward. Like there's no real secret sauce to this one. There's no alignment in this one to college-wide learning outcomes or extra student group breakdowns or anything like that. It's really just kind of a means to an end to be able to get some quick visibility without having to go in to your grade books or compile this information on your own to understand how students are performing at large. So those are kind of the two main, if you will, kind of standing live reports that you have access to for looking at your student assessment data. Outside of those reports, my team, myself, the assessment team are always standing by to help to dig into specific questions that you might have on particular courses or content within your programs and in your departments.